Good afternoon, everyone. I am Diane Allen West, and I will be presenting today the topic Human by Name Linguistic Footprints of Identicide. I just wanted to explain a little bit my background. I began doing work in Caribbean history, linguistics, archival studies, and now finally a PhD in historical linguistics. I focus on colonial socio-onomastics as a topic because I became interested in this field when I first discovered these slave monuments on my university campus. I was asked to do an assessment of them, and I began to do a little bit of digging, and I found that they were erected in 2007 in commemoration of the bicentennial anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade. And in honor of the people who were alive on the Mona and on the Papim estates, we erected these names. These persons were alive then. I really wanted to speak about this topic in terms of what happened for at the very beginning of slavery. We are proposing that the process of identicide and linguicide were essential features of colonization. Identicide speaks to the deliberate erasure of indigenous name identities, and linguicide speaks to the systematic proscription of the indigenous languages. That these two were intersecting processes that happened pretty much the same time at the very initiation of colonization. And with identicide and linguicide came really the erasure of a people which was justified in law. But this paper will speak about four things: the legalized crime of identicide, slave names as a seminal class of colonial naming, taxonomies of slave names, and the legacies of slave names as crime perpetuity. So identicide was legalized because the slave codes, which began in the Caribbean and then used as a template for the American South and subsequently the Francophone and the other Antilles, basically said that slaves were held pro nullis, pro mortuis, pro quadrupedibus, and they had no head in the state, no name, title, or register. They were not capable of being injured, nor could they take by purchase or descent. They had no heirs and could therefore make no will, exclusive of what was called their peculium. Whatever they acquired was their master's. They could not plead or be pleaded for, but were excluded from all civil concerns, whatever. And basically, pro nullis meant non existent, pro mortuis means till death, and pro quadrupedibus meant they were like four footed animals. And this was basically a summation of the law as found by William Goodell. I think he was presenting to Congress a summation of what all the slave codes in the American South at the time were basically representing. Made a ruling on it, Judge Shroud, in the same document, and he also summed it up that the cardinal principle of slavery is that the slave is not to be ranked among sentient beings, but among things, as an article of property, of chattel personal obtains, as undoubted law. In all these, the slaveholding states. This then, he says, is the definition of the terms slavery, slave, and slaveholding, as furnished by the slaveholding communities and as understood by jurists who have studied their legislation and jurisprudence. This is the theory of American slavery. I brought this up to point out that these were the legal bases on which identicide and the erasure of identities, which captured Africans came across with, were then subsequently erased. So, this is the source of the law. This is a document presented by Goodall, and it was in the courts presented to John Gray. So moving along, we see that in the British West Indies, The majority of the slave population, they were assigned not a full name as in a first and a last name, but a mononym, which is a single name. This was most popular system. There were some islands that had first and last names, but very few of them. So there were no patronyms, and the no patronyms were justified by the courts that declared that enslaved people, they're nobody's children, they can't be orphaned, they can't be widowed. But in the American colonies, however, there was by and large an exception because the majority of the records utilized protonymic or paternalistic surnames, which denoted property of. Sometimes the enslaved people were left nameless, and we can see this in the ads. For example, like in the runaway ads, this one was put out by Andrew Jackson, Stop the Runaways, where the escapee is not named, but if you look closely at the wording, he is missing his mulatto man slave, about 30 years old, 5 feet 1 inch tall. He speaks reasonably well, and he has a remarkably large foot. He speaks tolerably well. I think that's how it was worded, with a remarkably large foot. So descriptions here are given of this particular enslaved person, but that's where the mononym, such as Jack, would be um, would be made clear, along with the ethnonym, which is, he is of the Congo country. We can see here that sometimes these inscriptions are used because they are also very effective identifiers. Um, because very often the informants are people who are of the community, who know the difference between the Congo and the Mundingo and the the Yoruba, and the different subset ethnicities were known. So pointing that out would have been also very important to the identity. And then example that only mentions that there are well, in this case, what we see are captives. So people brought in, for example, Mary brought in by the Maroons, she's an Angola. We notice that's almost like not an adjective, but a noun. She's an Angola. Jack is a Mundingo, Money is a Mongola, and so forth and so forth. So Mary, Patience, Rachel, Jack, Money are the mononyms, but an Angola, a Mondingo, and a Mongola, these are the ethnonyms. And we can see how they're described to the owners. The owners' names are given. And also they're also identified by their markers, depending on the different brandings that they might have on their bodies. So these are ways of identifying enslaved people. But we want to point out that in the studying of African American history, the thing about names and naming going down through our histories is that many of the people who we have come to know as heroes and heroines had names which really were not their own names. We see, for example, that Harriet Tubman, she was born Araminta or called Minty Ross. Frederick Douglass as a child, he was Freddie Bailey. And then as a teen, when he escaped, he became Frederick Johnson before he selected the name Douglass from a favorite poem. Nat Turner was just Nat. And I think the name Turner only came about when his overseer, Samuel Turner, set out to find him. He was advertised as Nat Turner, but he was always just Nat. And Isabella Bell Beaumont-Free, we know, self-selected the name Sojourner Truth when she was called to represent her people, she says, and to spread hope and truth. So we know also of many, many other stories. A kid in South Africa, the age of 7, he goes to school. His name is Rolly Lala. And his teacher says to him, well, from now on, you will be called Nelson Mandela because you can't come to anything in life with English name. So there we have Nelson Mandela, who really was Rololala, and he had a clan name, which was Madiba. But back in those days, it was very normal in Nigeria and South Africa, in Ghana, that in all the English settlements, that people were given English names so that they could become somebody in life. In Jamaica, we have not taught it in our history either. That here we have our famous national hero, certainly one of our greatest national heroes, Samuel Sharp. He was the leader of the Great Baptist War. But Samuel Sharp never knew himself by that name. Neither did his mother or his siblings. To everyone, he was simply Archer. This was the name given him by his mother, we assume, and this was the name he was known by in his community, because Samuel Sharp really was his slave master, and he was known about town as Samuel's boy. And so today in Jamaica, we have many monuments. We have schools and roads and squares and buildings named after the slave master Samuel Sharp, while Archer's bones were broken into 100 pieces and scattered on a beach and buried under the sand in an unnamed grave. Such is the fate of the real Samuel Sharp, as we did not know him. Um, Moving along, we looked further afield and considered the other hemispheres, and one of the worst in terms of identicide was certainly the Portuguese Atlantic, Brazil to be specific, because in Brazil, many enslaved, most of them, were not really even given new names as they were in the Anglophone Atlantic. They were not initiated into a name automatically. Many of them, as much as 7 years, remained and stayed nameless. And they were merely called O Negro, the black, or Apeca, the peace, or many of them could be called O Escravo, which means the slave. But there was an option in Brazil that you could be given what you might call it. You could be given a name if you would accept a saint name. But the conditions of accepting a saint name is that you would get it through Christianization by denouncing your own indigenous spiritual beliefs. And Christianization essentially meant Catholicism. Many refused and many accepted. But Brazil today is the country with the greatest catalog of saint names, and some of them are listed here by Laura Alvarez Lopez, who does research into Brazilian names. We can see that there are many saints, and the saint names really had they were far-reaching, because if you were born a twin, there was a certain twin saints whose names you would have, and so forth and so forth. So there are many. The slave registers form the corpus of this study, and there are many example registers which can be seen. They were looked slightly different in different places, but less, they were a sort of template for the planter class or the overseers, or those who manage estates, to account for the slave population. So collectively, they formed a kind of census. And remember, this was put into British law because they wanted to have a means, a documentary means, by which to track the importation of enslaved people, because the slave trade had abolished the trade. So to show exorbitant increases would mean there were some sort of illicit importation going on. So planters were made by law in all of certainly the 18 British territories at the time to begin this process. Some began very early, some did not begin until somewhere in the middle, and some didn't begin at all. Some, like Belize and Cayman, I believe, just put in something on the eve of emancipation because they wanted compensation for their enslaved people. But these records are very, very important, and they look of the body of this research. There are very few records that exist like these, which have African names and Um, these records are not usually kept to be found among the normal records, but these are rare collections. And this is to give you an idea of how many volumes there are. Starting in 1870, well, starting as early as 1812 or 13 in some places, 1817 in the majority, and ending around 1834, we collected altogether 249 volumes, of which my country, Jamaica, accounted for more than half, or nearly half of it. And that was normal because Jamaica, as one country among 18, really had more than half of the population of the British West Indies alone. So Jamaica is kind of exceptional and significant in this regard. So we're looking at the names and we can derive taxonomies of slave names. And this is my own coining of, or my own neologisms that I have introduced to, for the ease of my research, to classify names. So colonial onames, I call them colonyms, can be divided into colonial toponyms, which is not concerned with this particular research, but this one is concerned with colonial anthroponyms, which I call colanthroponyms. And colanthroponyms have exonyms, which are the slave names, exclavonyms, and endonyms, which are the Akan names. The Akan names, or the acronyms, are pretty much a simpler group to deal with because the bulk of data is not that large. There are the Akan Day Names, which are a set of 14 names, so special names, and then there are a combined group of other African names. But the esclave names, or the slave names, I have many, many, many taxonomies. I'm just showing 12 of them here. So we can go through very quickly. There are aptronyms, and aptronyms really are indicating occupational classes. They're a very interesting set, really, because some of them were quite funny. We have eliminated some like crapper and so forth, but spitter, crapper, but boiler, cooper, mason, bosun, baker, smith, groomer, cook, stiller, sawyer, carpenter, carter, driver, swile. These were some of the more common ones. And if you can see very clearly the manuscript from St. Christopher, which is in Kitts, which this started, this is an inventory list that fed into later what became a registry. But you can see that many of these names were used as surnames here. You know, Cathar Driver, Shipio, Andrew Cooper, Fortune Sawyer, Edinburgh Carpenter, and so forth and so forth. So these were very critical names because they started out as mononyms and then at some point they became surnames. Caconyms, a very interesting syntactical group because caconyms are names that are phrasal. They are phrasal names and therefore compound forms of names. Caconyms can be described in today's terms as what we would call pejoratives, but it might have been very different then. Caconyms were certainly in the context of slave society something which was probably necessary to distinguish different persons or different enslaved people with the same names because there was a small catalog of names that circulated. So on any estate you could have 5 Marys, you could have 4 Bessies, 6 Johns, and so forth. So what distinguished people were, using indicators of age, shape, height, weight, or skin color. So we can see Old Betty, Old Cock as against Young Charlotte, Old Charles, Old Quamina, New Quamina. So that might have been someone who was recently added as opposed to someone who was previously there, old and new. And then there's size. So size also refers to seniority as well as maybe physical size. So big Celia and big Abba could be mothers who had little Celia and little Abba. Long Pamelia, I'm not so sure what long referred to, if it was height or maybe the length of her neck or something. But little Kafar and little Kaku, we can imagine might have been younger boys. So it might be size because size coordinates with age at some point. And color of the skin was very, very popular. Usually black something, black kitty, black familia, black nanny. I'm not so sure. I mean, they were all black people, but I suppose you had gradations like a sambo here, and the blood counting, of course, that approximated you more towards black or white went from any Creole person who could be mulatto, or meaning half and half, a quadroon, meaning quarter bloods, and octoroons, quinteroons, to pass. Pass meaning the person closest to what could be construed as white. So these are certainly practices we have condemned a lot over time, but they were very much markers and indicators of identity during the period of slavery, 16th, 17th, and 18th, and 19th century, early 19th century, that is. On, we have transonyms. I call transonyms because they are trans-onomized forms, and basically they refer to matronyms and ethnonyms and ordinals and topoanthonyms and so forth. So people were distinguished by, matronyms were very certainly something to note. Jemima's Mingo, Christiana's Robert, Beniba's Maria, and so forth. Ethnonyms, Igbo Suki versus Creole Suki, we can see that these were really combining one form with another forms. Ethnonyms and demonyms, as mentioned, were very clear markers, particularly in Brazil, where people were merely called by their ethnicities. Angola and Congo, Monjolo. You had very well-defined subgroups like the Mandango and the Bonjolo and the Waki and the Suku and the Shamba. These were forms of identity also. We had temporal names, characteronyms, appellatives, and the majority being protonymical names, which were paternalistic names. But temporal names could refer to an enslaved person called August, or Christmas or Easter. And characteronyms were really very biblical names, classical names, or Shakespearean names. Usually, a lot of Shakespearean characters came out.
Excuse me, Diane.
We have anthroponyms, persons who were named after cities in England, as against some places in Africa. So you could have Sudan or a Cairo as against a Kent or a Liverpool, a London or a Somerset. These were very popular names given to these people. Sometimes the English names reflected the origin of the slave master, like a Lincoln or, sorry. And very often the African ones represented somewhere that the African people came from. We have hypocoristic names. Some of them we call ironical names, Prince, Duke, Queen. They were usually condescensions and the result of bad humor. A palate mentioned. And the acronyms basically are two sets of names, male and female, each name representing a day that you were born on, and each one representing a sort of deity: the universe, peace, ocean, spider, earth, fertility, and God. The African names are very special because they are the only endonymic forms of naming that came into the Caribbean from Africa, meaning these were names that people might very likely have given themselves. And there were soul names because the system of naming in Africa was very different from in the European sense. Your soul basically chose a day to be. And there were other Akan names that could be mentioned, and these were attached to circumstances of birth. So a child could be born on the happy times or sad times, born given a name that determined what was happening at the time that they were born. So basically, to wrap up, we can compare the historical versus the linguistic questions that we asked for a study like this. Who named the slaves was really what historians worried about. And how can we classify these names or understand the onomastic properties are what linguists worry about. So, history has always been concerned with the agency of people to name themselves, and what are the evidences of African retentions, and how do these traditions reflect both African and European cultures. And this is important for us as a shared people, a fragmented sort of culture. We want to understand who influenced what in history. But in linguistics, we're looking at how to lexify, how to look at these lexical items as being unique or different. We can't touch too long on shame names. These existed for males and females. We saw names that looks to be sexist or insolent. Whether or not these things had any currency among slaves, no, but we imagine that they did. We can see on one plantation, all of the surnames were quite horrible: infamy, tyranny, demoralization, mal auro, chagrin, misery, and people who worked in factories being given names like syrup and limes and rum and punch and grog and so forth. These were quite, not very flattering and certainly not self names. So, in conclusion, we want to say that slave names are a legacy that, it teaches us about our past, or what we call our pastlessness, and not knowing our genealogies, acknowledging our severed bloodlines and fragmented histories. But we declare that people are made human by name. You are made and acknowledged to be human by name. Your name is your first property, and you have a right, an inalienable right to that name, and it's because of this that we call out for restorative justice, as the Jews did when they were denied their names and had to relinquish their names for fear of death, as the Chinese did when they were persecuted, and as other races have done at some other period in time. Names are important to a heritage of a people, and the knowledge of these names are something that we proclaim cultures have the right to defend. I would like to wrap up now and to say that there is so much more that can be said about that. With the limited time, we have, lots of references, and I would like to say thank you very much to Laura, to Louisa, to Chris, and to say respect and one love from Jamaica. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane, for that thought-provoking and fascinating presentation. Really appreciate it. I think maybe we could take one question. We're at 10 o'clock, so we don't have much time. We've got to move on to the next presentation, but perhaps we could take one question. Sharon says, thank you so much for this amazing and thought-provoking talk. Maria says, thank you so much for this impressive talk. Seems that it was very well received. Okay, we have a question here from Anna. She says, what is the difference between mononyms, caconyms, and nicknames?
Well, caconyms were, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, caconyms were very different because caconyms were phrasal names in the sense that they had an identifier, usually a modifier, plus a name or a noun. So Old Mary and Young Mary was really like a noun phrase rather than a typical name. And most caconyms in the context of slave names were constructed that way. Mononyms were basically the fact that they were given not as nicknames, but just as your name. So if you were to look through 90% or 90, maybe 95% of the slave registers, you'd never see an enslaved person with a last name. They didn't have a right to have one. So a mononym simply meant you have a single name and that's all you get. And in some cases, you don't get a name at all. So that was that. And a nickname might have been called, in terms of the register, an alias. So if you look at a register, there are aliases in one column, and then there are the names or the given names in another column. So a man called Kwashi might have been an alias, but his given name might have been John. So aliases or nicknames, or well, nicknames are very funny in a Caribbean context because you'll have a nickname that is an official nickname that is known
but you might have another nickname that is known within your house, in your in-group. So we have a double naming system which exists even today. So our nicknaming system, that's a whole other talk I'm going to have to give, because it's not like regular nicknames that are known to other cultures. It exists in a very different way in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. So what I can say is that nicknames and aliases were very much distinguished in terms of the registers.
Thank you, Diane. Sharon wonders whether you can share any information about slave naming in Barbados.
Yes, it was pretty much like Jamaica. Nothing very distinguishing except for the children. I know that Barbados is very outstanding in terms of how children were treated, and that was because of how slave societies were organized in Barbados. In Barbados, children were taken from their parents on plantations and they were given to a mother. So it was very common for you to find in Barbados a mother walking around with 50 kids following her about the place. She organized them and controlled them, so parents would be free to go and do work. This was very odd because it didn't happen in other plantations so much, in other communities or other societies, in as much as it happened in Barbados. This is a jobbing and the grouping of kids. And so what you would look at is a register for kids, is that in a group you'd have 30 sukis, or poor woman couldn't remember everybody's name, so you might have Suki 1 to 30, or John 1 to 15, or 15 Adams, and so forth. She probably had 5 names that 50 kids would share. So that was kind of like a very interesting development I found in Brazil. Not Brazil, in Barbados. That was not very much the case in every other place. And certainly a lot of acronyms in Barbados as well, and also non-traditional acronyms. A lot of that found in Barbados as well. I hope that I'm trying to go as fast as I can. I hope that answers anything.
Thank you, Diane. I'm sure there are so many more questions, but we need to move on to the next presentation. So, feel free to reach out to Diane with your questions. It's unfortunate we don't have more time, but we want to thank you for this wonderful presentation that has piqued our interest, most definitely. So we will move on.
You are very welcome. Yes. Thanks for having me.